Hello, this is Jim Phillips. I'm asked all the time about the origin and history of PALS. PALS is an acronym for the Phillips Arctic Living System. Where did it and the PALS foam clothing all come from? How did it all get started? Let me share that story with you. I kind of break this down into several sections or eras. The first one is kind of the preparation era. That was from my birth in 1947 through 1956. A lot of family camping and outdoor activities, and we did some things in the winter, but we didn't really do much in the snow because it was just too painful. There was a discovery era from 1957 and 1968, then the refinement era from 1969 to 83, the scientific and commercialization era from 1984 to 1990, the industrial training era from 91 to 2001, and then the reestablishment era of 2005 and 6, and then in 2007 and on, it is the energy and expansion era. The discovery era began in 1957 when at age 10 I had my first real snow camp, and by the way, it wasn't a whole lot of fun. From 1957 till 1962, we did 2 or more snow camps each winter. We kept going higher and colder and longer, but we were totally dependent on fire, and pain and suffering was the norm. So you'd say, why did I go? Well, my father was my first best friend, and he was my hero. He wanted to go and be out there, and so I wanted to be with him, and we just did it as a family. I became a Boy Scout in 1958, and that same year my father was elected Scoutmaster, and so we started camping year-round both as a family, but then also with the Boy Scouts. By 1961, we had learned to wrap our beds in plastic sheets and bury them in the snow so we could sleep warmer. But everything that we did in the winter centered around fire, campfires, fire all the time, and fire pits. You had to haul wood, get wood, and you were still cold, wet, and miserable. Yet we were getting better at it and enjoying it a little bit more. In 1962, we took our first wilderness snowshoe trip. This was a 5-day trip into the Pecos Wilderness to visit lakes that had never been seen from the ground in winter. It was a challenging trip on snowshoes, high altitude, steep trails, but it was beautiful. The vistas that we saw was fabulous. However, we were still totally dependent on fire, and even during the day while we were hiking, sometimes we'd have to stop and build a fire so we could thaw out our poor frozen feet. We made it to the lake. We chopped holes in the ice to measure the thickness of the ice to report back to the Forest Service. We saw things that nobody had seen up there before. It was fabulous. Yet it was also a trip that had a significant amount of pain in it. And on the way out, as we were traveling back on the same trail that we had made coming in, at one point my father stopped and he was looking out across that beautiful area, and he said, we have got to find a better way to do this or stop going. We're just not masochists. And that was the genesis for the quest for what we now call PALS. When he got back home, he was still thinking about this and wondering what he could do. Being an engineer, he looked at the problem and he said, other people don't seem to have an answer. We're reading the books, we're talking to the survival people, we're listening to the mountain climbers, we're doing all the things as they say to do, and we're just as cold and wet and miserable as they are. So what can we do? That's when he hit upon the idea of using some of this open-cell polyurethane foam. It was not very common back then, but he had access to it in the industry in which he worked, and so I remember him sitting on the living room floor, and he was cutting out this odd-shaped piece of foam and trying to figure out how to tuck and fold and roll and stuff it, and he finally made it into kind of a booty that he shoved down inside of this muckluck that he had and went for a walk that night when it was 10 below zero. He stayed out longer than he had ever been able to and came back and said for the first time he's had warm feet at temperatures below zero. In January of 1963, we used those mucklucks on a 5-day snowshoe trip into another area and had warm feet for the first time on that trip. And then the thought was, well, if you can take care of your feet, how about your hands? How about your head? How about your whole body? What about sleeping? And so over time, it evolved into what we now have as an entire system. In 1964, we discovered another muckluck shell that had a vulcanized tread on it, so it was much more walkable. And about that time, we started camping at Wolf Creek Pass, Colorado. In 1964, Boy's Life published an article contributed to by my father called Make Warm Mucklucks for Winter Hiking. In the summer of 1964, we made the first foam sleeping bag and used it on a 10-day summer hike and had the best nights ever. In the winter of 1965, the moisture handling pad of open cell foam was added underneath the sleeping bag. Then in 1967, I decided I wanted to make the entire mucklucks. You see, the problem was these shells that we were using and shoving the foam down inside, it was just too tight on my feet. My father had smaller feet than I did, and my toes were always cramped. So I said, I'm going to get me a pair of overshoes and get me some cloth, and I'm going to figure out how to put this thing together. And so I built them in 1967. And at the same time, I thought, instead of just rolling up the foam the way we've done it, I'm going to glue it together and kind of make a pant and shirt out of it and try that and see how it worked. I used those on the trip that I took with Boy Scouts and explorers that I had. I was at the University of New Mexico, and I was a scout leader, and so I took them into the Pecos Wilderness to visit another lake that nobody had ever seen before. The trail was fantastic. The trees, the shadows, the snow, we loved those things. And now we had warm feet, and as a matter of fact, we were warm from head to foot. I stood on top of a mountain peak that I don't think has ever been visited in the winter, and it was in winds that was about 50 miles an hour, and the temperature was approximately 20 below zero, and we could have stayed out there all day if we needed to. It was a beautiful place to be. When you're warm, comfortable, and dry, the wilderness is not threatening. So we started to have a lot of fun because we were comfortable. For several years previous, my father and I had talked about taking the ultimate snow camp, which would be to go to Alaska in winter. And after looking at the map and the airline schedules and figured out that, by golly, you could just hop a plane and fly all the way to the Arctic, to the most northern tip of Alaska, Point Barrow. And so that's what we did. In the end of February, early March of 1968, we headed for the Arctic. We didn't have a lot of equipment to take, and we didn't need a lot of equipment, so we each had a pack for myself, for my dad, and for our dog, carrying everything that we needed for a trip that was going to last more than 2 weeks. The thing that's unique about this clothing is it has a very broad temperature range. When we left home, we were fully dressed for the Arctic, standing here in San Francisco in our Arctic clothing. And by the way, we did look a little strange. However, we were able to do that, and when we finally arrived at Point Barrow, Alaska, we just wandered off the plane. The temperature's 30 below zero, and after a little while, you put on your hat and your mittens. After getting our backpacks off the plane, we simply put them on and headed out to sea, walked off the end of the runway out onto that frozen ocean, where we would set up our camp. And over a couple of days, we built our main igloo out there. And the thing that's fascinating is we could see the curvature of the earth in that frozen sea. Now, you need to know that living like this can be very eloquent. You see, we had a sleeping shelf inside that was elevated above the cooking area, which is off to the right. And in the morning, instead of getting up to fix breakfast, you just kind of rolled over and you could have breakfast in bed. You see, this is wonderful living out there. Once the people at the Naval Arctic Research Laboratory understood that we weren't going to be a burden to them, we weren't going to be injured or be asking for help or to be rescued, we just literally had the run of the place. We also enjoyed visiting the people in the village of Barrow and got to do some very unique things and see things and experience things you just don't normally get to do because we could be up there and we could do it safely and comfortably. It was a fascinating environment up there to see and do things that I had never experienced before. The low sun, the constant cold. As a matter of fact, the highest temperature that we saw during that trip was 10 below zero. It ranged between 30 below to 10 below for the high, but we were safe and comfortable so we could thoroughly enjoy that. And as we're preparing to leave, the parting shot of me on top of the igloo with my dog Aztec. After traveling south for a day and a half, we found ourselves in Los Angeles with a connection that didn't work, and so we had to sleep outside on park benches underneath palm trees with Arctic clothing on. I guess you couldn't get away with that nowadays, but in 1968, we were just fine. But you see, the point is that we were able to leave home in the clothing, travel in warm conditions when we're inside, spend time outside constantly at below zero, and then travel back home in the same clothing. And we could do that comfortably. And when you use the clothing properly, it has an extraordinarily broad temperature range. From 1969 to 1983, I would call it the refinement and the play era. One of the things that was important for me to learn about was hypothermia from firsthand experience. I took a trip in 1971 snowshoeing across Jenny Lake and Jackson Hole in January, and I did not have the full PALS system with me. As a matter of fact, the only thing I had was the footwear, and the rest of it was conventional layer clothing. But you see, when it's cold and dry, you can get away with that. However, on this trip, the temperatures were hovering around freezing, and it snowed constantly, this very wet, mushy snow, and we became wet. And it's the closest I've ever come to losing my life in the wilderness, because I went into very, very significant hypothermia. Knowing the conditions and knowing the symptoms now, I would estimate that my core temperature was probably about 84 degrees, which is right on the edge of slipping into a coma. I was young, strong, and didn't know how much trouble I was in, and I had a friend with me that I'd got into this predicament, and I was focused on getting him out of there rather than focusing on me and how badly I felt. If I had been solo on that trip, I would not have made it, because I would have simply sat down and said, I need to rest. Well, I understand hypothermia, how severe it can be, and how badly it hurts. During this period of time, the clothing and the understanding of the clothing was evolving, and we were making improvements to it, but especially we were making improvements of how we used it and the rest of the doctrine that goes along with living out in the cold, about the nutrition, about water, and all those kinds of things. We had originally started by just inserting foam into other mittens, but that didn't work as well as making our own when we learned how to put the foam together and form them and cover them with fabric. Hats could be made also. The mucklucks we had been using all along, but my dad started to follow suit with the idea of making his own, and it was getting hard to find these shells that we were buying, so using overshoes and other boots and attaching a top to them. In most cases, the liner was simply a flat piece of foam that was folded. You folded it in half, then you folded it again, then you picked up the center part, stepped down inside of it, started folding it, wrapping it around your foot, wrapping it again and again, and then you would put that down inside of the shell that you had made and lace it up, buckle it up, and there you had the footwear. Not exactly like putting on a sock, but yet it worked extraordinarily well. The clothing was similarly put together. We call it roll and stuff. Here's all the foam pieces laid out flat. And for the pants, you simply take the foam and you just roll it up and shove it down inside the pants. The outer shell holds it together. Then you climb inside of them. And oh, by the way, one of the things that's important is you're not trying to put any layers or any kind of long johns or anything underneath, because that will destroy its performance. The shirt is done very similarly. For the sleeves, you just roll them up, shove them down inside. Then you wrap the torso part around you and then slip the shirt on over top, which is going to hold everything together. It's crude, but it works so very, very well. We had learned how to take parkas apart and add foam inside of them so that now you could add that on top if it really got tough out there. And with the hood on and the hat on, it was just about like being inside. We also made this face tunnel or snorkel hood that kept the wind off of you when you got outside in these low temperatures with very high winds. The sleeping system consisted of, from the bottom up, plastic sheet, which is your ground cloth, and bed wrap on top of that parachute cloth, which is the de-icing cloth, then the open cell urethane foam pad, which is the moisture handling pad, then the sleeping bag, which is actually made out of the urethane foam also. Then the plastic is wrapped around this and tucked in so you can put it down in the snow. Most of the time, because we're sleeping with our clothing on and with that sleeping bag, we don't have to bury those beds anymore unless it's extremely severe in terms of low temperatures and high winds. In 1981, my father was approached by Maxie Anderson because he had been trying to make this round-the-world balloon flight. They had made it across the Atlantic a few years before, but had nearly frozen to death on that trip. He knew that he could send a balloon around the world, but he was concerned if the people could stay warm. Reading articles about what we were doing and having other people talk to him, he came to my dad and said, "Could you keep me warm?" He took him camping at Wolf Creek Pass, Colorado, where the temperature was 30 below zero, and he stayed out there comfortably, and that's when Maxie said, "Now I know we can make it around the world with the Jules Verne's flight." Unfortunately, he was killed in a ballooning accident before they could make the final attempt, but in the shakedown cruises where he traveled at high altitudes and extremely cold temperatures, they were safe and comfortable. He was confident they could make it around the world because of the clothing. All along the way, there had been numerous newspaper articles. There were some other things written in books about us. There was also magazine articles, radio appearances. we had attracted enough attention that in 1983, the CBS network sent the PM magazine crew out to do filming of us in the field as we were training people how to live at 20, 30, and 40 below zero. In fact, on this very trip, one of the nights it was 42 below zero, and here you see people sleeping right outside with their beds wrapped in plastic sheets, sleeping on top of the snow. Getting up in the morning is easy because you go to bed with all your clothing on. You slide out of the sleeping bag. The only thing you have to put on is the footwear. Here's a picture that I very often have used in my lectures to simply make a statement about some of the wonderful things you can do out there. Here we are eating breakfast at 13 below zero. Put a lantern inside the igloo and it glows like this orb out there. As we're getting ready to break up from the class, here's all of the students on top of an igloo. Everything will fit in a backpack, and you can travel across country if you need to. Through the years, we had been experimenting with different ways of putting it together and different kind of styles, if you will, realizing that it was still ugly. But, my attitude is style is being warm at 40 below zero, no matter what it looks like. From 1984 through 1990, I would call that the scientific and commercialization era. In 1984, Boy Scouts of America published part of the story of the foam clothing and the PALS clothing in their field book. While being interviewed by a group of newspaper writers and editors, and I was talking about the idea of no fire, no shelter, your clothing self-dries. If you get wet, you're going to be okay, and it'll dry out. The colder it is, the faster it dries. All these very unusual things. In fact, no waterproofing. You don't use waterproofing. So this was going against what they normally heard. And they said, does that really work that way? And of course I said it did. And after a little while of discussion, it came down to they gave me a challenge, which was to prove just how well I could survive if I got wet. Now, I didn't have any idea about what they were going to challenge me to do. The editor-in-chief told me, he said, Jim, I want you to go to one of our frozen lakes, chop a hole in the ice, take your funny, homemade, non-waterproof clothing, let yourself down in the hole in the ice, get yourself completely wet, do not change clothing, no fire, no shelter, and spend the night. Would you do that? And I said, okay. He asked me, have you ever done that before? And I said, well, is that normal human behavior? We agreed it was not. I mean, that's crazy. I'd never thought about doing that. I've been wet before, but not by that means. The other part of that story is this. He looked at me and he said, that's amazing. We'd love to do a story on you. And he said, by the way, it'll be a good story, and it doesn't make any difference whether you live or die. And I said, thank you, I think. Anyway, that's what we did. There's 18 inches of ice on this lake. The water temperature, of course, is 32 degrees in contact with the ice. And I simply crawled down inside of that with this clothing. Now, I got to tell you this. This is not fun. This hurts like blue blazes. When that 32-degree water runs up against your skin, it's extremely unpleasant. I slipped down into that hole in the ice, laid back in it, and did my best to enjoy myself. I spent 15 minutes in there. I drove myself in the hypothermia. I was in very serious pain, doing my best here to look casual and smile, but really it's more of a grimace. Came out of that hole in the ice. Now, if the water will run in, it'll run out. The only thing I knew to do, because I hadn't done this before, is squeeze the water out. So I squatted down, I patted down, I squeegeed down every way I could to get the water out of there, and then just went active, which simply means walk and move. And I had camp activities because I'm going to spend the night out there. Now, I'm not a SEAL, and I'm not going to curl up beside that hole in the ice in just my clothing that I went through the hole. You see, nighttime clothing is called a sleeping bag. Now, I'm not taking that clothing off because you don't take that clothing off the way that we do it. When it's wet, you leave it on, you take it to bed because, see, the sleeping bag, being made the same way the clothing is, it'll handle the moisture. And that's exactly what I did. Later on that night, after it got dark and it was time to go to bed, I simply went to bed as I normally would. My clothing was still very damp, in some areas quite wet. In the night, as a matter of fact, in the night it wasn't all that pleasant because it was like sleeping in a steam bath. But through the night, my clothing dried, and by morning, there was only a slight dampness in my clothing. After I got up and moved around a little bit more, my clothing went completely dry. The sleeping bag is now damp. You sleep in the sleeping bag one more night, and it goes completely dry. I don't know of any other way to do this. And if you had done that with traditional clothing and traditional sleeping bags, it would be dangerous, if not downright deadly. This has performance that you can find no place else. Now, there was obviously some articles that were written about that, and it started legends, if you will. I know where legends come from, and I won't claim part of what went on. However, this caught enough attention of people that I was invited back to the Washington, D.C. area to meet with a number of retired generals who were very interested in helping the military stay warm. I met with some fabulous people back there. They gave me the challenge of making something that was a little more normal looking and a little more military looking. So I set up a little sewing operation in my garage and began the process of figuring out how to do this. We put together some clothing that looked pretty good. As a matter of fact, it worked extraordinarily well. What we then needed was a major industrial partner that could help take this to the world, not just to the military, but to industrial, commercial, and recreation markets, and that was going to take a lot of money and a lot of effort. Through our contacts, we were introduced to Burlington Industries, who at that time was looking for some new technologies and some new markets to penetrate. We were at the right place at the right time. I spent many hours at corporate headquarters and at the research facilities, giving them a complete rundown on the technology, how and why it worked the best we understood it, and what it would do and what it would not do. As a part of their due diligence, they, shall I say, volunteered one of their senior research scientists, Dr. Vince Ambrosiani, to come out to Utah and in January, which was just a few weeks away from our meetings in January, come out and go snow camping with me. Now, they thought he was a very good choice because, number one, he had never snow camped in all of his life, and he announced that he always had cold, sweaty feet all year round, so we figured, well, if we take care of him, we can take care of anybody. Vince came out in the first part of January. We went up into the mountains, and he spent the 2 days and a night out there where the nighttime temperature was only 5 below zero. But I remember him sitting in the kitchen the next morning as he was just pondering this. He got real quiet for a little while. He looked at me and he said, Jim, he says, I don't understand. I said, well, what don't you understand? He says, I don't understand what everybody talks about, cold and wet and miserable and being in the snow. He said, what are they talking about? And I looked at him and I said, tell you what, Vince, we'll go back to my house. We'll take off this clothing and I'll put on the conventional layering stuff that they use. We'll come back up here and spend another night. He looked at me and said, I get it. It's all about the clothing. Based on his reports, we then went forward with the project to do further research and development. As a result of that, over the next 2 years, I flew more than 1 million miles in the U.S. and Canada, giving briefings and doing presentations as well as all the research that we had to do. As we're getting started with the project, I told them one of the things I wanted to do was get some new data, get real data. Because you see, we'd been going camping and doing these things and just saying, well, this is how I feel. But I wanted to be able to measure it. We had a budget. We could get instrumentation. So we went above the Arctic Circle, about 1,000 miles north of the Arctic Circle, at Resolute Bay in the Northwest Territories. And we were going to set up camp for 3 weeks. We have thermocouples taped all over our body. We have several different sets of clothing we're going to rotate through. Some of our PALS clothing made different ways, as well as conventional clothing and layered clothing from other people, including the military's EQUEX system, which is the layers of polypropylene, fleece, and Gore-Tex. We're going to be using that also. So we build our camp. The individual on the left is wearing a layered system made by Patagonia, and he has these thermocouples on his body. He's reading temperatures, and they're being logged by the individual on the right. Here's an indication of just how well it's going. Take a look at the person on the left. He's got his hands in his armpits. That's because his hands are cold. The reason his hands are cold is not just because the handwear is inadequate, but because his whole body is being chilled, and he doesn't have full blood supply into his hands, and so they get chilly. The person on the right, dressed in PALS, has almost no insulation on his hands. He has a very thin anti-contact glove, so he won't stick to things. The temperatures are below zero. And he has essentially bare hands out there because he has a warm core and he has full circulation of blood into his fingers. I'm wearing the EQUEX system. On my feet is the vapor barrier boot, sometimes called the bunny boot, with thermocouples taped on my toes. And then you can see how we can take the readings even with the footwear on. On the upper part of the body, here's where thermocouples break out, so you can take those readings. But the data tells it all, and this was so important for us to have because we learned things we hadn't been able to see before. During the first 4 days, I'm wearing the EQUEX system, and then I changed into the PALS system. Take a look at the top graph up there, that yellow one, and you can see that it starts to go down after the third, the fourth day. It's really taking a dip. That's a shoulder temperature up around behind where you don't have a lot of venting. Next graph shows the foot temperature, the green line with the big spikes up and down. And E, by the way, stands for exercise. And notice that the foot temperature is going down and down and down, even the peaks. That lowest E down there, that was after a 5-mile hike uphill. I could get my feet warmed up to almost 60 degrees for a high. And by the way, that's still pain. The next graph shows it all because that top blue line, that is core temperature. And you see that core temperature is going down, which means that all the temperatures are going down, and especially the extremities are freezing out. And oh, by the way, I was wearing EQUEX during the warmest period. At the beginning of the 5th day, I took off the EQUEX system and I put on PALS. As a matter of fact, I needed to get it off because if I had had to stay in it, in that environment, living outside, pretty soon my core temperature was going to match the outside air temperature, and that's not a good idea. I put the PALS system on, and all of my temperatures immediately rebounded, particularly the core temperature, and I was normal the rest of the trip. The other thing that's almost humorous is, you see, we're supposed to rotate through this clothing system. Each one of us try the different ones. And I said, okay, who's next? Who's going to wear this? And both of those guys looked at me and they said, we're not. We saw what happened to you. So I'm the only one that wore it up there. We were interested in the moisture accumulation in the clothing and in the sleeping systems, so we had scales and ways of measuring it up there, and this is what we found. The traditional fiber-filled bags, we had very, very expensive super below-zero sleeping bags as well as down bags, and then we had our simple homemade PALS sleeping bags made the way the clothing is. This is what we discovered. The PALS sleeping bag was slept in 21 nights. It had accumulated during that trip just about 8 ounces of water. Now, what we did was when we left up there, we took everything, we double bagged it into large garbage bags, hauled everything back home, took it out, weighed everything, and then allowed things to dry completely, weighed them again so you could see how much water was in them. The fiber-filled bag that we had up there had only been slept in 8 nights, and it had accumulated almost 9 pounds of water, which means that probably by the 9th or 10th night out there, it was going to turn into an absolute ice cube, and you would be miserable in it. We had the opportunity to use some of the Inuit clothing so we could have a comparison with what we were doing. There was a lot of testing that went on, some of them inside of chambers, such as here where I'm sitting sedentary with thermocouples on my body taking readings, with my face in a fan where it can blow to see how well the hood seals up, laying down, being inactive, taking naps, outside, sleeping outside without sleeping bags. We built our own cold box to test footwear in. Here's thermocouples on the feet. You'd sit inside of a warm room with your legs going down in these insulated leggings, and of course you have boots on your feet. You could have one boot on one foot, another kind of boot on the other foot, and then measure the performance right then and there. It was a very effective way of doing it, and we typically ran that cold box at about 30 below zero. You simply lift up the skirt, you can stand up and then step up out of the box, and here, just after exiting, you can see the frost that's forming all over those boots because of the very cold temperatures that they were exposed to. Many times I would sit in my office working on the computer while I had my feet in the box logging temperatures, and if you'll notice on the one foot, the cold foot here, it's 51.3 degrees, and I've got to tell you, that is pain. Testing was done by others also. We went to Kansas State University where a team there would evaluate the clothing and its performance. Here we are dressing a mannequin, putting the clothing on it, getting it ready for the testing, and then the chamber is closed up, and it was both on mannequins as well as live people doing different kinds of industrial tasks to determine how well the clothing would work. We also had to learn how to test materials. Air permeability is one of the things that you need to know, and the other one is the moisture vapor transfer rate and how to get those at their optimum values. Not only was testing done in chambers and in the laboratory, but also in the field. This is Mount Washington, New Hampshire in January, one of the coldest and windiest places that you can get at in the, shall we say, the civilized world. At this particular time, it's 13 below zero, and I'm leaning into 110 mile an hour wind. I spent 3 days out on the mountain. I slept out there all the time. I went to Mount Washington to test some of the features of the equipment to be sure we had them right. And as a result of that, when I came back, we made adjustments and some improvements to it. That's the reason you go. This is the 6th Marine Headquarter, Camp Lejeune. We had a marvelous experience working with the Marines. They're a great bunch of people. The first year we were doing field testing with them, this is their field headquarters. We're playing war games out there, and so they're setting up their headquarters, camouflaging those things. We had a small group of Marines that are dressed in the first version of the clothing, which didn't look very military, but it was to find out the performance and then have them tell us what they needed changed and how we would improve it. They slept right outside, as you can see here. Their buddies are in the tents behind, but these guys are right outside. It's very interesting. There was a number of cold injuries while we were out there. Here we have 2 guys dressed in the PALS clothing who are rescuing one of their Marine buddies who has very, very severely chilled feet. As a matter of fact, he ended up with some frostbite. A little bit later, he was medevaced out of there. These guys have his feet on their warm bellies because they're toasty warm, and they're helping to revive him and get him prepared to be removed from the field. I spent time in the field observing all their different activities because later on we were able to make some recommendations about what we might change. In 1987, I was off to Eielson Air Force Base in Alaska working with the Alaskan Air Command. At Eielson, I picked up 2 of the cold weather survival instructors the Air Force has, and we're putting them in the clothing and we're heading north. In this case, we're going to Prudhoe Bay, Alaska. We slept right outside in the open, and we had a very favorable reports both from that test and from other testing that the Alaskan Air Command gave us. In January 1987, I'm at Fort Greely, Alaska, to do some tests with the Army there. That's down around Delta Junction. We have a crew of people that's going to be using the clothing out in the field as well as in some chamber tests. Here the men have thermocouple probes all over their bodies. We have 4 men dressed in ECWEX and we have 4 men dressed in PALS. They're going into a chamber where they're going to set sedentary at 60 below zero. By the time 1 hour was up, all 4 of the individuals dressed in ECWEX had been removed because of pain and they had dangerously low temperatures. At 2 hours, when the test was slated to end, all of the men in PALS were still in the chamber, and when they asked them how long could you stay in here, their reply was, well, all day, it's just kind of boring. But the test had to end because the test protocol said 2 hours. And in fact, I asked the commander there, I said, why does this test only go 2 hours? And he said, well, nobody's ever been able to stay in there up to 2 hours, so we don't need a test longer than that. So I guess we broke the record with them. Some of the men sleeping outside with thermocouples on their bodies in their sleeping bags. And it's interesting to note, you see the green sleeping bag behind the 2 white ones there. That's the standard military bag. That guy is all huddled up inside of it. And our guys are sleeping with their heads out and their sleeping bags unzipped. The second year of testing with the Marines, here we are at Fort McCoy, Wisconsin again, in a very low-profile setting. That's the thing we could do. You see, when you take a look at the way they normally do it, here's a tent where they have 10 men that stay in the tent, and they have to drag that thing around on a toboggan, a sled. They call it an accio, and it's very difficult to move, as well as you can find the thing. Here we are again, back to our soldiers that are up on a hill there. There was actually 12 of them camped up there. You couldn't hardly find them. Some of them slept like this, as you can see, not even completely inside the sleeping bag, just hanging out of it, whereas everybody else is huddled in their tents. Here I am with my low-profile bivy sack in front of their tent. I was staying with the officers over there. During that same period of time, the Marines asked me to do a cold weather safety and training, and also training on how to use the clothing and what performance they could get from it. So we have a film crew here that's filming me. During this period of time, all the design and development was being done in the basement of my home with my designer. We also needed to improve the footwear over what we had been doing, which was buying overshoes and other boots and recycling them. So as a part of the development cycle, I began making a wax positive of what I thought maybe a sole would be like. I just went through the process of building that up, making a negative of it so we could then mold a urethane in it and make these boots, both the blue one and the green one that you see there, to give us another idea of where we wanted to go with the footwear. From there, we got into test injection molding of another sole design on a small prototype machine that ultimately led us to utilize an 18-station Desma machine for mass production of the boots you see here. The blue one on the right was the final design. If you take a look at this boot in the cutaway, it has a lot of features that are buried inside. It looks like just a simple foam-filled boot, but there's a moisture trap, there's shanks, there's heel counters and toe counters, there are ankle stays, and it's all designed to give both comfort but to move moisture, because you can wear that boot 24 hours a day, 7 days a week without moisture problems. We tested all the other boots that we could find, and you can see the heat loss rate from the competitors here. The far right, the bar that's the lowest, that's the one you want, because that's indicating the number of degrees of temperature loss per hour. We also had to do sewing development, and during the Burlington era, the sewing partner was Russell Mills using their Russell Athletic Department. So we went through the process of learning what kind of machines, how do you put these things together, and my job was to be sure that we had the quality and performance, and their job was to figure out how to build it. So there's quite a number of people that were involved in figuring those things out in that period. One of the things I like to do is take people that are in control of certain areas and have them in the field so they understand what we're doing and why we're doing it. From Russell Mills, I took two of the guys that were the managers over the sewing division. They were from Alabama, and they saw snow on TV, but they hadn't experienced it. They came out and went snow camping with our team at 22 below zero, 3 days and 2 nights below zero the entire time. One of the things we were able to do with our little cold test box was take it to trade shows. We would set it up and literally draw crowds there as people would come around and look at some real-world testing going on before their very eyes. If you look at the temperature instruments here, you can see what's going on. The cold box is run at minus 35. The right foot, which is on the left side here, has a toe temperature of 89 degrees, which is a normal toe temperature, toasty warm, very, very comfortable. The foot temperature on the right is in the 50s, and let me tell you, that is pain. Oliver Wood was the director of photography for Die Hard 2. He said this, because on their set they were using the PALS clothing. I've worked in all weather conditions, and I can tell you that cold weather has always been my biggest fear. Since working in your outfits, I fear no more. They can send me to the North Pole, and it wouldn't worry me. Those of the crew who didn't purchase the whole outfit ended up getting the boots. It was a new experience for everyone not having cold feet. One of the guys fell through the ice, and he stayed warm in his outfit even though wet. Thanks for producing such a great product. In 1987, I had the opportunity to personally train and outfit Jim Lovell. He was the commander of Apollo 13. He was going with 2 of his buddies on a North Pole expedition, so we outfitted all of them. This is what he said after returning. His cold weather protection system, PALS clothing, unlike any other available, is capable of providing indefinite protection in the most severe cold weather known to man. Without a doubt, we'll continue to use the system on our future trips to the cold weather extremes of the world. In 1987, Burlington Industries was involved in an unfriendly takeover attempt. In the process of fending off the takeover through a leveraged buyout, they put themselves into $2.2 billion in debt, which was more than they could easily handle. And since our project was not yet commercialized and cash flowing, they withdrew from the project, and so we had to go on our own. In 1989, Popular Science magazine gave me one of their 100 Greatest Achievements in Science and Technology awards. I was invited back to New York as a part of the ceremonies. Not only does the clothing have to perform well, but it also has to look good. One of the things we were able to continue with after Burlington's withdrawal was working out how to make the clothing look good. And they weren't just put on models so you could get a nice picture. They were used by real people in the real world. I went up and trained Jeff King, who is one of the individuals who's won the Iditarod a number of times. In a training I was doing with him, we were in the field with his dogs and with his teams using the clothing. This is at the end of the race when we're talking to one of the other individuals who was using the PALS clothing. Lavon Barvey is one of the individuals who was a front runner using the clothing, and the clothing gave him an edge. The following year after this picture was taken, Lavon said that the clothing had saved his life when his team went off and left him, and he had nothing except the clothing with him when the temperatures were running as cold as 50 below zero, and it was an entire day before he could get to safety. What we have is a breakthrough technology for workers exposed to sub-freezing temperatures. The thing that results from this is increased productivity because there's a greater amount of working time. Better comfort means better morale. There's also less time off for cold-related sickness and injury. We did a number of tests and evaluations with industry that demonstrated this. This results in greater profitability is the bottom line, and the other thing is you have unparalleled safety. Can stay warm and dry 24 hours a day, day after day, and months at a time. When you're comfortable, you have better awareness of what's going on around you. You have lower legal and insurance problems, and you just simply have guaranteed warmth. Here's a final little thought in this area. We did some other curious experiments. Yes, the clothing is designed for the cold, but I also proved that we can use the same basic technology with some changes to protect you from heat and extreme heat. We did some testing in desert settings with thermocouples that proved that you were better off using a modified version of this clothing versus wearing a bathing suit or thin clothing. So there's all kinds of potential for the future in multiple markets. From 1991 to 2001 was the industrial training era. There were two primary classes I was teaching. One of them is Winter Safety Made Real. The other one is Winter Without Worries. A part of what you have to learn about safety is it's what you control inside of your head. During the classroom periods, as I had all these different settings out there, sometimes I would wear a sign around my neck that has a big X on it and says, "I am here." The idea is simply this: people worry about getting lost. Well, if you know that you're here, which is someplace, how can you be lost if you're always someplace? You can only be lost if you're no place. I'm never no place because I'm always someplace because I know that I'm here. I guess you follow that. You see, it's an attitude of how you look at things. It's a part of your safety. We did a lot of our training in the field in all kinds of conditions, during the day, at night, during snowstorms. We had small groups, we had large groups out there doing a variety of tasks in the field and teaching them how they'd be okay if their snowcat breaks down, if they become stranded for whatever reason. We also showed them the resources that were available in a snowcat or another vehicle that could help them. Our classroom very often looked like this, where we would all sit around with a little bit of a windbreak. A lot of times we were just simply standing out in the snow and in the blizzards while the class was ongoing. I had the pleasure of having with me my oldest son and my youngest son much of the time, so we had the third generation in the field teaching these things. Our mode of travel was provided by our industrial clients using their snowcats to get us into the field. Here's a picture of student housing at Snow College. Here's the students building it. I'm not going to build it for them. They built their own housing. They stayed in them. Their beds slipped down inside of those things. And oh, by the way, try this with your pup tent. Now, we had all the comforts of home. We'd have here's a bathroom out there. Here's the trail off to another place into the trees, and here's the trail down to this one that's dug into the side of a snowdrift. The vistas and the views were fantastic. Classroom was simple, but nice, white, and clean. Another thing that was going on during this era was the development and proof of what we now call the thermal johns, which is a half-inch variety of the foam clothing that can be worn underneath conventional clothing. Any kind of clothing would be okay, although some things are better than others. You can wear them with your regular blue jeans, or you can put it underneath anything else that you'd want to use. Another thing I was able to do during this period also was publish several of the courses. The first class that I produced was Surviving Against All Odds, with workbook and with the audio portion of it. We've also produced several DVDs to train people in both the attitude and the understanding of what it takes to be okay in the cold, and how and why the clothing works, and what do you need to do to evacuate during emergencies. 2005 and 6 was the beginning of reestablishing our position in this. To do that takes a team of people, a core of people that we're going to build. That has to be done with experience, and so those who've wanted to join with us are in the field, learning this equipment, what it'll do, and how and why it works from the inside out, not speaking from a position of theory, but from a position of experience. That's where strength is. Well, there's even more to the story, but that's plenty for now. Next, people want to know, is this for me? Should I get involved? How do I get involved? What's next? I invite you to get more information on the SafeHarborAlliance.com webpage. In fact, there's a really dynamite video you'll want to see. It's of a radio interview I recently recorded in October 2010 with first-time users of PALS foam clothing. This grandmother and grandfather attended my Winter Without Worries class, made their own PALS foam clothing, and went snow camping for the very first time. You have got to hear their story. I think they are better spokesmen to new people for the Winter Without Worries class and the PALS approach than I am. You see, people look at me as a tough guy who's been doing this for decades, and they think they don't have what it takes. Nothing could be further from the truth. You can see Jim and Connie Cheney's story in the video, What Others Say About Winter Without Worries. You'll find it on safeharboralliance.com. Have a terrific day, and may you enjoy winter without worries.